So for starters, thank you for doing this, and thanks to Progressive Mass, because if you weren't here, I'd have nothing to write about. So I really appreciate all that you do. So I'm kind of a local. I've lived here since 1979. My mom graduated from what was then Girls Latin School, and went to New York, and then came back. And earlier in my career, when I did a column for the Globe for 20 years, it was syndicated by the Post, so I was mostly writing about national stuff, although I did some local stuff. And I think it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics is local. And if you want to influence national politics, you have to have vibrant local politics. So I wrote a piece about a year ago called The Movement, the Presidency, and the Party, about how local democracy influences what national progressive politics does. And the more I stuck my head out of the foxhole and looked at what was going on in my own state, the more curious I got about why is it that the whole is smaller than the sum of its parts? And why is it that we send all these great progressives to Washington, and yet we can't get more progressive legislation through Beacon Hill? And so, as a one-time political scientist, I did a kind of a political science-y analysis of how the system works. And the first thing I noticed was Ron Mariano, and the fact that we have a set of rules that would make Boss Tweed blush. And stuff just gets deep-sixed, and they wait until the last week, and then they cut a deal behind closed doors. I learned this wonderful word, spotting. Never heard that. That word doesn't exist in any other state. How many of you have heard of the word spotting? See that? Now you guys are acting. Spotting
How many
means,
people who just raised their hand are legislators?
Yeah. So spotting is a sin against the norms of Beacon Hill. And spotting doesn't refer to something else. It means that you expose how a legislator actually voted, which might embarrass him or her and cause them to be embarrassed with their constituents and produce a little bit of accountability. So, long story short, I kind of looked at all the aspects of what is a dysfunctional system and what the feedback loops are, and why, despite the fact that we got all these great groups, we've got citizens of the Commonwealth who want progressive policies, we can't get from here to there. And that was the gist of the piece. You and I had a great talk earlier this week about, okay, how do you break into this closed circle where you don't have home rule, you have to have the legislature deign to grant a home rule petition, you've got bossism in the legislature, you've got a tremendous amount of influence by corporate Democrats, even though it appears to be a one-party state. A lot of the one party is the wrong kind of one party. And where do you break into that closed circle? You also suffer from fragmentation. It's the worst state in the country in terms of own source revenue for cities, blah, 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 blah. The rest of it's in this article. So anyway, rather than just repeat the article, let's talk.
Well, okay, so there's a lot there, and I do, if you haven't read, I suspect, this being a room full of nerds, I suspect most people have read it, and even before knowing that you were going to be on the billing today. But so we've got bossism in the State House, the lack of home rule, which leads to the on-source revenue problem. You mentioned the influence of corporate Democrats.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that? Why is that so, right? We have a lot of progressives in Massachusetts also. Why aren't they in control of the bus infrastructure in the legislature?
Right. So one of the things that we talk about this is the fact that incumbents almost never get knocked off. And if incumbents are not afraid of being primaried, then they're going to go to where the local power elite is. And the local power elite's the business elite, the real estate people, Mariano's buddies, and they're going to be very disinclined to cross the leadership, and the leadership is going to be in bed with corporate Democrats. So that means that it's kind of a closed circle. And even if you do a lot of lobbying, and God bless you, you're going to make changes kind of at the margin. And things that the Chamber of Commerce and the real estate people are opposed to are going to have a hell of a difficult time passing. And every once in a while you have a ballot initiative, which is kind of in case of emergency break glass, and that's great. That's a little bit of actual democracy, although a lot of those lead to negotiation with the legislature rather than passing intact, but glad that it's there. And so, given the way the system works, entrenched power elites have the power. And if they're not afraid of being held accountable, if they're not afraid maybe of being challenged in a primary, they're not going to pay attention to the likes of us. So we were talking about what's the best way of breaking into this closed circle. Should we try and get all of the small progressive groups in the state to maybe unite? Should we hope that somehow reform is going to come from inside the legislature, as it did briefly during the Kavarian speaker period, which lasted, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, and then as soon as he left, it went back to the old system of complete non-transparency and non-accountability. And so I kind of conclude, and I'd love to hear Jamie on this, because Jamie was one of the few people who went on the record.
By Jamie, you mean Jamie Eldridge?
Yeah. I know Jamie's in this room. Thank you. I probably talked to about 50 people for this article, about 45 of whom would only talk to me on background, and that tells you something. But
can I just interject?
Sure, please.
Say a little bit more about that, right? Because you mentioned about, there's a system of boss rule in the legislature. I think, many folks in this room have encountered it, have probably analyzed it, but I think it, for me, reading the article and then talking with you a little bit offline, it was so, I don't know, sort of validating of one's sanity, and also instructive to understand the comparison with other states that you've been doing, and really sort of give us the anatomy of what are the mechanisms, right, for that tight control in the legislature, and why is it that 45 of the 50 people you spoke to were afraid to do so on the record?
Okay, so that's 3 questions, and let me unpack that, and then let me leave what I was going to say for last, because that's one possible way of breaking into this closed system, and that's the conversation I had with Jamie, and with you. So there's a feedback loop, and the feedback loop is that if the legislature is pretty much a closed system, that makes it harder to go up against the legislature. And because you got to do business with them. You got to get a quarter of a loaf if you can. And that makes people reluctant to go head to head and criticize the legislature. So it's disabling, it's disempowering. And a very good example of that is the unions. So here's SEIU and the governor who gets a kind of an incomplete. She gets a B-, incomplete, good on some things, not so good on other things. But one of the things that Healy did was she gave a very nice raise to the lowest paid home care workers in 1199. Okay, stop, pause, beat. Now, do you think SEIU is going to go out front and criticizing her? Well, maybe, maybe not. But it's an example of the way the game is played. And the unions, who were the biggest players, they got the most money, they really have to be front and center in this coalition, and they've got their own interest to tend to. And this brings me to the comparison with the other states. So I compared this with 2 other states that are not as dysfunctional, that are much more functional in terms of the progressive movement really having influence. And the best example is Connecticut, where, first of all, Connecticut is one of 2 states where you can get your own ballot line as a third party. And that means the Working Families Party is a player in Connecticut. Woo. The other thing that happened is that all the progressive groups came together about 30 years ago in a group called Connecticut Citizen Action, not Citizen Action, CCAG. Connecticut, somebody help me out, Community Action Group, something like that, coalition. So this is a coalition, the unions, the community groups, people of color, all the progressive organizers somehow managed to put their egos at the door, check their egos at the door, and have a functional coalition that not only was an issue coalition and an organizing coalition, but that knocked off incumbents and got people elected to the legislature. And they were fortunate enough to have a legislature that never had the kind of boss rules, that was much more transparent than ours. And so over time, Connecticut went from being a purple state to being a blue state to being a progressive blue state. And progressives are probably 40% of the legislature for a while. They had a very influential Speaker of the House. And so the whole psychology is different. You can make incumbents afraid of being challenged in a primary. You can actually have an inside game and an outside game, where the inside game and the outside game are coordinated. And same thing in Minnesota, where the Democrats, I think, have a majority of 1 vote in one house and 2 votes in the other house, but they're really well organized. And in the session last year, they just ran the table. They got the whole deferred progressive agenda enacted. So I guess the question is, where do we break into this closed circle in Massachusetts, and what might be learned from these other states?
What's the answer?
Well, I think one answer is, if we could knock off 10 incumbents, we could put the fear of God into the rest of the legislature. You know, and these are low turnout, low number. Mariano got elected with 10,000 votes. That's all. And so, if we could concentrate our fire, and some of the chapters that you guys have could be starting points. Over the years, occasionally we have a very good year, we knock off 1 or 2 or 3. Sometimes we don't knock off any, and it's a vicious circle. If it's a fool's errand to try and knock off an incumbent, you're going to find difficulty getting someone to run against the incumbent. You're going to have difficulty raising the money. And so the fantasy I had, and this was an insight of Jamie's, you got all these wealthy liberals in Massachusetts raising money for Elizabeth Warren and Eddie Markey and other out-of-state people. I mean, their focus is on national politics. And granted, national politics, as we were saying before, very, very important, especially in 2024. But if you could say to these folks, look, you're a citizen of the Commonwealth, and this is allegedly a blue state, but it's the wrong kind of blue. And you should be doing something for where you live. So you're a multimillionaire. How about putting 25,000 bucks? That's petty cash. That's a rounding error into a fund to challenge some incumbents so we can get more progressives into the legislature. Yeah. After doing all this research and having a really interesting time learning about this with all these interviews, and then trying to connect the dots, that was the best I could come up with. So what do you think of that?
I think that's a great idea. I wish you had written this article 2 years ago.
I owe Sonia a big apology, because one of the things I didn't cover in this piece was Sonia's challenge to Maura Healey. And the reason I didn't cover it, first of all, I ran out of words. But secondly, when you're going up against somebody who is a de facto incumbent, you're stuck in a downward spiral before you start. People are not going to want to give you money because they think it's almost a sure thing that she's going to get elected. And so it's hard to get to first base. I think it's somewhat easier to, and by the way, none of the other statewide races were comparable. They were either open, or you didn't have someone who was a de facto incumbent, and you could have some real contests. So I think that's why it's slightly lower hanging fruit to start with the state legislature. Because then it doesn't take that much money, and you can focus on 5 or 10 or 15 districts where incumbents have some vulnerability because they've never done any hard work, because no one's ever challenged them. And you can mount a surprise attack. And that's what they did in Connecticut, by the way. I mean, once CCAG got off the ground, the first thing they did was they knocked off several incumbents, and that got people's attention. So, anyway.
I think that the sort of surprise factor, right, is important to call out here. When you and I were talking a little bit, earlier this week in advance of today, I was sort of diving back into the article and calling out how you describe what it's like in Connecticut, right? The structures in the Connecticut legislature that enable the feedback loops that you're talking about, us not having, right, the closed system here in Massachusetts. And I'll read it because it sounds so heavenly to me. And I'm looking at Jamie, right? I feel like I'm gonna get a nod from Jamie. All committee votes are recorded. Roll calls are normal, as are floor amendments. The term, it doesn't say this in the article, but we see this off point, right? The term spotting does not exist in other states. Full text of bills are available, details are negotiable, and challenges to the leadership positions are not viewed as hostile acts. All that in turn makes it possible to hold legislators accountable. And so, it raised the question for me, well, how did it come to be that way in Connecticut? Or at least, how has it not ceased to be that way in Connecticut? And, you mentioned the just sort of the historical order in which things happen to occur, that the progressive, the statewide organizing in Connecticut happened sort of in time to get into power. So then it was essentially, I don't want to put words in your mouth, tell me if I got this right, but that is sort of impossible to then go change the rules because there's enough power being held by progressives to block that. Is that a right takeaway?
Basically, I mean, there was a political establishment in Connecticut, but in the Connecticut legislature, and it maintained power the usual way by disciplining the rank and file. But in terms of the structure of the rules, there was always more transparency. And so when progressives started electing people to office, there really wasn't the opportunity on the part of the old guard to change the rules to keep them from playing a normal democratic role. And then the progressives started electing speakers and majority leaders and taking power. And as you know better than anybody, this is about power, right? This is about amplifying our power wherever we have the opportunity to do it. And I think one of the reasons the Working Families Party has been successful in places where it has been successful, and I don't want to forget to talk about Worcester, because I think that's really important. If you can get people to play a role in local elections, knock on doors, and make phone calls, and contact voters, however else you can contact voters, you have a tremendous asset to bring to a candidate. And in a race that doesn't have a lot of voters in it, a selectman race or a city council race or a state legislature race, having 50 or 100 or 200 highly motivated people who know how to organize is an unbelievable asset. And so in Worcester, where the Working Families Party is actually trying to build from the bottom up, they don't have their own ballot line, but they use the Working Families brand. They endorse people, they work to elect people, and they have now 4 of the 9 members of the city council. And they didn't do it by, big headlines, they just did it by quiet, effective organizing. And I think that's the recipe.
Okay, so I hear the prescription of going hard on the electoral side, right, in order to get a better, get more power, frankly, on the advocate, the policy-making side of the equation. In your article, you also note that when you look at the broad statewide map, or even a series of sub-statewide races, right? That in the past few years, Massachusetts voters have rejected this long era of clubby, this is your words, right? But I would have never endorsed them, right? A long era of clubby, male-centrist, white ethnic politics. But I want to pull those adjectives apart a little bit and sort of dissect a little more, right? Male, white ethnic looking, clubby, and centrist are different adjectives, they all mean different things, and the opposites of those things don't by definition always travel together. So is it possible that voters have rejected some of those things, but not other of those things?
Yeah, that's a really important question. In other words, the fact that you no longer have white, male, Irish, Italian, ethnic politics in Boston of the kind that you've had for a century, and that you have a very different sort of mayor, that doesn't mean that the opposite of that, as a coalition, necessarily comes together. That doesn't mean that people of color necessarily have amassed more power, or that the different pieces of the potential coalition are good at working together. And I think one thing I noticed in reporting this piece was all of the fragmentation. And I think the challenge is to find strategies and issues that overcome the fragmentation and put people on the same side when there are differences. So Mayor Wu got into trouble, I think justifiably, with this plan to relocate the O'Brien. From her point of view, you know, there's this great facility way on the fringe of the city, and from the point of view of Roxbury, this is the pride and joy. This is the most racially diverse of the exam schools or the specialty schools. And what are you doing? And why didn't you consult us? So it's, and I could think of 10 other examples where different constituencies in the potential coalition have different interests. And coming up with strategies to bridge those interests is really hard. It takes leadership, it takes listening. I'm a real fan of the mayor's, but one of the things she got criticized for, and the people that I spoke with, she's not a good enough listener. She goes off with a few advisors and says, okay, I made up my mind, this is what I'm going to do. That's not great. You've got to be, if you're in politics, or journalism for that matter, you got to listen. And sometimes you have to really know how to check your ego at the door. So, yeah, I think the implicit point in the question is very, very well taken. Just because Walsh and Menino are no longer running the joint, it doesn't mean you have partners.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, I said just because Walsh and Menino are no longer running the joint, it doesn't mean that our tribe has gotten all of its different parts together and that we're running the joint.
I also, I think also what I'm trying to get at in the question is gauging where we are at with the will of the electorate, right? We need to do gauging where we're at and, punching at or above our weight in organizing, but also understanding where the electorate is. And, Lord knows I made this case many times during the gubernatorial race, and I still profoundly believe it, right? Like in my feet, I believe it, that voters statewide in Massachusetts, certainly there's pockets, right? Boston, you mentioned Worcester, which we should definitely talk to, let's do that next. Springfield, Lawrence, I saw Amanda Jonathan in the House from Lawrence, that there are real pockets, right? But then there's, outside of the gateway cities in Massachusetts, and, do Massachusetts voters outside of those pockets of, progressivism want what the people in this room want? I believe that the answer is yes, truly. But many people have pushed back, right? And will say, well, do Massachusetts voters really want that? And so I think maybe that's my question for you, Bob, is what are the guide points that you see that affirm that?
My proof of concept is that we with one exception, we send progressives to Washington. I mean, the majority of the citizens of this state elected Elizabeth Warren, and they elected Eddie Markey. And most of the delegation to the House is progressive. And so I assume from that, and also from polling data, that 55, 60, 65% of the voters of the Commonwealth are for progressive policies. Now, that doesn't mean that they're for every progressive policy as it affects them locally. And so you see this in housing, where you've got a huge NIMBY problem, and even the transit-oriented housing legislation, which is a good start, doesn't even specify affordable. And even that is a lightning rod. You look at what happened in Braintree, where they tried to put, I don't know, 480 or so units of medium-rise housing that wasn't even affordable housing. And the good citizens of Braintree went berserk. So this is a problem. I mean, housing is an example, and certainly education is an example. You look at what happened in liberal, allegedly liberal places like Brookline and Newton, where you get kind of a quarter of a loaf or a half a loaf on the affordable housing. So yeah. On the other hand, take rent control. If you had home rule on rent control, you'd have a lot of rent control. So I think you have to take it issue by issue by issue. But again, if you could start challenging incumbents, the legislature as a whole would be more representative of public opinion in the Commonwealth as a whole. That doesn't mean there aren't going to be issues where the suburbs are going to fight you like hell. I mean, that's a given. But I don't think the suburbs are a majority, by the way. I think the suburbs are maybe 40% of the electorate.
Yeah, and I would agree, in my experience, housing, sometimes transit policy, deeply balkanizing issues, but from my experience, education was a unifier. On the campaign trail, talking about early education, talking about debt-free access to public higher education, big unifying themes there. And I find, there's so much to work with, right?
Well, and debt, this is one of my pet issues. 40 years ago, public higher education was free. It was free. It was socialized. It was just like K through 12. And then what happened was legislatures start cutting taxes, and then they start having budget deficits, and well, let's just pile a little bit of tuition onto the state university. So now it costs $30,000 a year for an in-state student to go to a public university when you count tuition fees, books, room and board. That's more than it cost to go to a private university 40 years ago. That's just a crime. And you do have people in other states. Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania just yesterday put forward a plan whereby I'm going to raise taxes on rich people so that no person of low or moderate income is going to have to pay more than $1,000 a year. We could do that here. And a lot of the people in the legislature are graduates of public universities. I mean, come on.
I think we got a lot of supporters. Jonathan, do you want me to, should we shift completely to sticky note questions from the audience?
That's what we have now. I'd say anybody else, if anybody wants to submit it.
I'd love to hear from Senator Elbridge.
That's how you spot him. I'm gonna pop this question in here that I got from Jonathan from an audience member. I think it's a really interesting one. But Jamie's no what's the expression? Shy violet, retiring violet, shrinking violet. So some clever person in the audience has asked, would, in your opinion, Bob, increasing the salaries for state reps, and I'm going to just editorialize here and interpret a little bit. Maybe we're talking about the base salary as opposed to the stipends that leadership gets to add on. Would increasing the base salary for state reps help or discourage their desire to align themselves with corporate power structures?
I think it's a two-part reform. I think you increase their base salaries and you take away the ability of the leadership to add to their salary. Right now the leadership, at the discretion of the leadership, has the ability to substantially increase the total remuneration of about half the members of the legislature. And so there it is. You want to know how power works? That's how power works.
Before I jump to this question, I do want to, you mentioned about Worcester. Can you give us like the elevator version of Worcester?
Well, the elevator version of Worcester is that, I don't think I'm giving away any trade secrets here. So Working Families Party has been active in New York and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and they are trying to go into at least 20 other states. But they're doing it in a low-key kind of way. They're not doing it with banners waving. And they're doing it by building from the grassroots up. And so Worcester, not because some commissar in the National Party said, okay, Worcester, but because local people in Worcester saw this as a good model. So Worcester, you have a functioning working families party. That's and they endorse and they door knock, and it's not just city council, it's school committee and a lot of other down ballot races. And they're a very major force now in Worcester. I don't know that they're a very major force anywhere else. It's interesting. I think there was one other town, and I'm forgetting which, where they've kind of gotten their feet wet. But that's how they're doing it.
All right, so this is an interesting, I think, a good segue to this next question. There's been a push since 2016 to take over state Democratic parties to build a more progressive base and apply pressure to elected officials. How effective do you think this is, and how essential to making a state more progressive? And as you're talking about Worcester, I'm thinking about, does Worcester offer us a sort of microcosm case study for that?
Yeah, I know of about 15 state parties, the best of which is Wisconsin, where you have really inspired leadership that's made a difference, that's put money into county parties, and used the party to help build cadres of local leadership. That doesn't describe Massachusetts, to say the least. So, given that there's a finite amount of political energy, knowing what I know about the Commonwealth, I don't think I'd start with trying to take over the state board.
I would also agree with that. Here's a spotting question for you. Which incumbent races should be targeted? What criteria would you use to achieve the results that we want?
I'm not sure my knowledge, as they say, is granular enough, but I think I would pick places where you have some progressive local activism on which to build, and where you have lazy, vulnerable incumbents. And I would have to do some more homework to say, this is my top 10.
I can think of some other people who have got granular knowledge.
Just quickly.
All right, I think
Just
we're not.
quickly for
Okay,
time check,
yeah.
you can bundle some of the last ones
Okay.
together.
All right. I'm gonna work on questioning while you answer this next one. Term limits. A valid question?
No. We have term limits in the United States. They're called elections. And when you have really gifted legislators, the last thing, and we do have a few of them, including in this room, the last thing in the world you want is to get them artificially forced out of office, because what happens? They become lobbyists. And the other thing that happens is the permanent government of lobbyists and legislative staff has even more power. So I think it's a completely false remedy, a snare and a delusion, as the saying goes.
I'm going to take another minute to read these questions, so I'm just going to give you another question of mine while I'm reading these. Can you talk to us about what does Deval Patrick's tenure in office have to teach us?
Well, so Deval Patrick, who I think was a terrific governor, a terrific guy, and the fact that he got reelected in very difficult years is proof of that. But Deval Patrick got his head handed to him by the legislature. And the problem there is, if you are a progressive Democrat and the legislature is corporate Democrat, the power doesn't come with the office. You just got to negotiate whatever you can negotiate. And I think Maura Healey, as I wrote in the piece, the takeaway from that was, I don't want to be Deval Patrick, I want to be Charlie Baker. And about 11 different people said to me, Maura Healey really wants to be Charlie Baker's third term. And so, how do you fix that? Well, you fix that by getting more progressives into the legislature and by having more power at the grassroots, and the two things are two sides of the same coin. And, the legislature would rather have a Republican that they have more in common with. Charlie Baker was perfect. He was a social liberal, a fiscal conservative. He was in the pocket of big business. They'd rather have a Republican like that than a progressive Democrat. And if they have to have a Democrat, they'd rather have something like Maura Healey.
You guys are really making my job hard here with
Some real questions.
excellent and discreet questions. Very bundleable. I'm gonna try and do a lightning round here, and I'm gonna read you 3 questions and see if you can pick out some themes that might run across them, even though they're one of it. It's not an easy charge, I know. All right. Why has there been almost no progress on making the legislature more transparent? What strategies might work? Number 2, wait. Number 2, some legislators run and win on progressive issues, but then fall in line with leadership once elected. How do we hold them accountable? And then the last one is, I think this is another sort of comparison with other states question. Have you seen unions in other states that are, sort of tied into the progressive, the Democratic power structure, go up against politicians who have given them some goodies?
Okay, so what was the first one?
Sorry, I feel your pain, Bob. People used to do this to me all the time when I was a candidate. All right, the first one was, there's been a lot of discussion and efforts in recent years about changing the rules in the legislature, but
Right,
very
okay.
little progress on
Okay.
that. Why? And what can we do better to get them to change?
Because the bosses would kneecap you if you really tried to get serious. You know, Eddie Markey got famous when he went up against leadership, when he was in the State House as a young man, and they moved his desk to the basement to punish him, literally. And he famously said, they can tell me where to sit, but nobody tells me where I stand. Great line. The problem is he lost the fight. And you need a kind of critical mass of reformers in order to go up against leadership and change the rules, and we don't have that.
All right, so that's a good segue to the second one, which was when legislators choose not to
Right.
pick those fights, how do we hold them accountable?
So I think when a progressive gets elected to the legislature, and you know this, and Jamie knows this, some progressives actually find ways of being effective. Others just kind of fall in line with the leadership, and still others, after a couple of terms, just give it up and say, I'm not getting anything done, I'm going to get a life. And this is one of the consequences of boss rule, that good people, a long talk with John McDonough. Anybody remember John McDonough, who was a great socialist, you should pardon the expression, legislator, and, really knocked himself out and finally said, all right, I did my bit, I got other things to do with my life. And so I think that's one category of good people who don't give in, but realize that it kind of starts feeling like a fool's errand. Other people make their peace with the leadership, and still others do find ways of being effective.
All right, I'm gonna sort of lean on my teacher training here. One of my favorite things, the sort of tricks they give you to do in teacher school is to give your students a do now. This is something you write on the blackboard when students walk in the door. Open your book to page 72 and answer questions 3 and 4. So we have clarity and crisp orders going on in this room. If you could give us a do now here at Progressive Mass, what would it be?
2 things. One, think harder about more effective coalitions with other progressive groups, including even uniting with other progressive groups. I don't quite understand why you've got one progressive group that's kind of a pickup team that does ballot initiatives every so often, but they're not the same as other progressive groups. So come up with ways of overcoming some of this disabling fragmentation. And 2, think hard about this strategy of coming together to knock off incumbents. So that's the